All right, so it is the first episode in September to come out. So, as is my tradition, speaking of segments that aren't directly related to helping you live your life deeper, as is my tradition, these traditions are going to live on, Jesse. Uh, I talk about the books I read the month before. So, I want to briefly mention the 5 books I read in August of 2022. Now, I have to say, this list is a summer list. So, a warning. It's very much influenced by the fact I was on vacation. So you're going to see the beginning of the list is vacation books, and then the other part of the list is I got back from vacation. All right, so let me start with Goldeneye. I mentioned this on the show before. 2016 book by Matthew Parker. This is a book about Ian Flemming, the novelist who created James Bond, about the house he built in Jamaica and its influence, his time in Jamaica and its influence on the James Bond series. It's a British book, very deeply researched. I learned quite a bit about late stage colonial England, what happened in Jamaica, how that country was transformed. You get a lot of interesting context and a lot of tidbits about how Fleming and his life. It's basically a biography of Fleming. It's basically a biography of late stage colonialism in the British Empire, all mixed up into this package. A very ambitious book. Yeah, it's interesting. Also, a lot of good, cabin, what you might call. There's a book called Cabin Porn, where it's just pictures of beautiful cabins. This is sort of like deep work writing porn, right? It's on a bluff writing over a cove that you snorkel in every day. So you get a lot of that too. One interesting point to say about that book: when Ian Flemming, this is revealed in the book, when Ian Flemming left the service after the war, so World War II, he was obviously like in the military, and that's where he was stationed in Jamaica briefly. That's how he found out about it, and that's why he built his house there. He got a job after the war with a newspaper group that owned the Sunday Times, and he was the manager, coordinator of foreign correspondence. His contract he negotiated included 3 months vacation a year. So that's how he could go to Jamaica every winter. It's just his contract. He was like, I just am gone in the winter. So, I mean, of course, this is British class privilege at its finest. You could just imagine his boss being like, "Good show, old chap. Yes, you'd go away in the winter. You can't work then." By the way, spot on English accent.
Very good.
Very
I was
good.
just in Scotland. Sounds identical.
Exactly. I would pass as a native in Scotland. But I mentioned this earlier in the show. Yeah, right now you have to be like a pseudo aristocrat in late 1940s Britain to get a contract like that. But why is that not more common? I mean, if you're Facebook, are you not trying to attract engineers by saying, hey, and if you're willing to do 9/12 of the salary, you can take 3 months off a year, you would get more people. We need more variety like this. That should not be so rare. So there we go. All right, book number 2. So I read Goldeneye. I said, well, I better read a James Bond book. And I'm reading about his house, and I know so much about Fleming. I was on vacation at the time. It's like I should probably read a James Bond book. Interesting observation. They're temporarily not available on Kindle. I don't really know what's going on here. Just a standard James Bond book. American translations are not available on Kindle. I think there's been a transfer of rights. I think something about Amazon buying Paramount, and maybe Paramount owns the rights. And I saw something, I should look into this deeper. I saw something about maybe they're reformatting and going to republish these, but it was very hard to find. So I basically got a pirated copy, the only one I could find on my Kindle, because I was on vacation. I couldn't just Amazon a book. The only one I could find is basically a pirated copy of Moonraker. It's it's a 1960s James Bond novel. Interesting point, 2 interesting points about it. One, it has the first third of the book is James Bond playing bridge at a fancy club in London. Second 2/3 of the book, he is at a high-tech missile installation trying to stop a villain from dropping a nuclear bomb on London. So it seems a little incongruous. I looked into it. Turns out Moonraker was based off a teleplay that Fleming wrote about the missile and this or that. It wasn't long enough. It wasn't long enough when he translated to a book. Like, it's not long enough to sell us a novel. So he's like, well, I'll just add a scene, an extended scene where he plays bridge with the villain. And you know what? It's a great scene. Like the whole premise of the scene is the villain's cheating and M asks Bond, come figure out how he's cheating. And they get into all, this is so Fleming, all of the details of this very fancy upper crust club and the food and how they, and the specific drinks that they're drinking and sort of classic Fleming. Point number 2, it's a surprisingly modern techno thriller. I think we give credit to Crichton. We give credit to Clancy as sort of inventing this genre of high-paced adventure type thriller writing that has a lot of technology. Moonraker feels like it could have been from that same genre. I mean, it's a lot of the technology of the missiles and how it's going to work. There's these details involved of it reads like a modern techno thriller. I don't think Fleming gets enough credit for techno thriller writing. I guess I had assumed that James Bond books were going to be a little bit more like British and ornate or maybe like a little bit more sort of classic spy type writing. We're going to have this sort of spy who came out of the cold, Alistair MacLean style writing. No, it reads like Crichton. This missile and whatever. Interesting point number 3. This was before the space programs got started. So Fleming's take on space technology, though specific, is very wrong. So it's clearly he was just guessing, this is the early 60s. He was just guessing what would be involved in sending rockets. In his world, his guess was like, obviously, like you can't send a rocket very far without the fire melting it. So like the whole plot was around how this villain had cornered the market on this special material that could hold up to the flames of a rocket, and that was going to be the key. And it's not even a ballistic missile. It's just a missile that can go 1,000 miles. Sub-ballistic required special material and this huge thing. And it was interesting. All right. Then this was, speaking of techno thriller, so also on vacation, this was at the house. I always try to find a thriller just like where I am. They had a Michael Crichton techno thriller that I had not read, 2004's State of Fear. And my memory was I didn't read this, even though I used to read all the Crichton. I didn't read this one because I had heard it was sort of weirdly, grumpily, sort of like polemically anti-climate change. Like the whole book was just him being grumpy. This is kind of what I had heard about environmentalists and climate change scientists. Reality, that's true. It does read as like he was a grumpy guy. But I mean, he was grumpy. He has these long... he has citations throughout the book, and he has this character, this MIT professor, whose whole job is to have conversations with good intentioned but annoying environmentally minded people who are like, but everyone just knows that blah, blah, blah about climate change. And then the MIT professor, speaking as a proxy for Crichton, would be like, well, it's actually not true, blah, blah, blah. And then Crichton would put real citations under there. So I don't know. Someone got under his skin about this. I think a Greenpeace boat ran over his dog or something. I'm not sure. So that is true. Also, it's not his best, unrelated to that, because it starts too slow. It's 150 pages before you're really rolling at what the actual plot is. Once it gets rolling, though, actually very well-paced thriller. Really great set pieces. There's one in Antarctica that's pretty cool. And again, this speaks to his grumpiness. There's a actor who's clearly supposed to be Martin Sheen. It's an actor who played the president on TV. Actually, yeah, that's right. The timing's right. Who's like very environmentalist. Spoiler alert, gets eaten by cannibals in the Solomon Islands. So here's what I'd say. If you can get through 100 pages, it's a fine paced thriller. He's good at pacing thrillers. And if you don't like climate change, you'll love it, but it's also otherwise kind of annoying. All right, quickly, 2 other books. Washington Goes to War, written by David Brinkley in the 1980s. David Brinkley, the former ABC News correspondent. It is a book about Washington, D.C. and the transformation it made because of World War II. And the interesting thing about the book is that in the 80s, when Brinkley was writing this, the leaders, the people who were, not 18-year-olds, but were a little bit older during World War II, they were all dying. And so there was this sort of race against time where he went to gather all these oral histories. And if you live in Washington, D.C., it's a cool book. It talks about how 1940, Washington, D.C. is a sleepy, very southern town. And by 1945, it's a completely different thing. So if you live in D.C., very interesting. If you don't, probably not. Well written, though. Brinkley's it's a really good Really well written nonfiction book. So hats off. And then finally, Tolkien. It's a 2015 biography of Tolkien written by Raymond Edwards. Caveat emptor, it is an academic biography. So it really gets deep into the work academically that Tolkien was working on and its influence on the books he eventually wrote. So it's written by a scholar who's in a similar field. And it's the study of ancient linguistics, but from a standpoint of using the language to try to recreate stuff about the culture, and it's a very precise field. And so it can be a little bit rough going. Two things I'll point out about this, then we'll move on. Number one, the reason why Lord of the Rings was so successful is that Tolkien just spent decades building a mythology for Anglo-Saxon England, because there wasn't one. So there was a founding mythology for Norse culture. There's a founding mythology for Germanic cultures, but it was lost. Whatever this was for Britain was lost. And so he was basically creating one from scratch, and he spent decades. He called it his legendarium. And at some point he kind of moved away from it being specifically about England and about a sort of fantastical realm. That is what he pulled from for The Hobbit a little bit, and then deeply for Lord of the Rings. So he had just decades of work as someone who is it's called philology is what they called it back then, an expert at ancient languages and its connection to culture and mythology. And he had all of that worked out. So that's why when you read Lord of the Rings, it feels like one of these lost culture books where they're just referencing this rich, deep world that feels like it's real. It's because he not only created this world, but he created this world with academic soundness. I mean, this is a guy who, for fun, was organizing Icelandic mythology reading groups where they would read in the ancient Icelandic languages, Viking sagas. And so that's why that was so good and why it's so hard. Nothing else really approaches the depth you get in Lord of the Rings, that sense of reality, if there's a deep culture here that this takes place on, is because it was like the world's expert on doing that who spent his whole life doing it. Number two, it's a painful book to read if you're a professor, because the whole thing is about his frustration with academic administrative load. I mean, his whole life was defined by being overwhelmed by academic load and non-research type work. And he was constantly short on money and constantly stressed out. And this was sort of post-war liberal England. So even after, he couldn't just sort of leave and be like, I'm just going to write, because even after Lord of the Rings became a huge hit, the taxation rates were such in England at the time that, as Edwards talks about it, it helped. But like, it didn't make him wealthy, even at like a lower level, because you could lose like 80+% of your royalty income like that. The government was like, thank you. So he was not, so it's not like he could, so even at the very height of his success, like wasn't making him that wealthy. So interesting. So it stressed me out, Jesse, though. I was like, man, this is just like detailing. It makes modern academic life seem free and flexible and great. I mean, Oxford in the early part of the 20th century just sounds like it was brutal. Just the work they would pour on you, and the infighting, and it's an interesting portrait of academia.
Talk about slow productivity, though, when he was coming up with that world, right?
Decades.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then even when he was writing these books, like The Hobbit, it's a 10-year window between when he was like starting to work out the story for his kids and when he sort of finally published it. Like, he would just spend decades on things. Yeah, it's definitely slow productivity. Like, you can't have Lord of the Rings without 20 years of philology.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So it's a cool book. Again, it's not super approachable. His son wrote a book. Christopher wrote a book that gets really into like his work habits and stuff like this, and focuses more on the Lord of the Rings. Like, that's probably the better book than this, unless you're into linguistics.